Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturette on relations between propositions. Now, these relations in this lecturette will be focused on those based on truth. There will be others that are based on pragmatic meaning, and those will be included in another lecturette. Now, we have truth conditions for expressions and propositions, and those are extremely useful. But one of the even more useful results of using truth conditions is that the propositions relate to each other in specific ways, and we can employ those relations to make predictions and test predictions. So for instance, one of those is the example of synonyms. When two propositions are synonymous, they mean the same thing. On a truth conditional semantics, meaning the same thing means having the same truth conditions. So that is to say, if you have two propositions, let's say P and Q, whenever P is true, Q is true. And whenever P is false, Q is false. Right? That would make them synonyms. And it also goes in the other direction, so if Q is true, P is true, and then if Q is true, or Q is false, P is false. So it doesn't really matter what we put here, we can flip those around. Now, if they're synonymous, that's useful, right? Because if we figure out what one of them means, we predict that the other proposition will mean the same thing, and that the conditions that apply to one can be transferred to another. We'll also see that synonymy allows us to replace expressions, right? If we're combining meanings and two expressions have the same meaning, well, then you should be able to switch them out, right? And you don't affect the meaning because they mean the same thing. Now, when they don't mean the same thing, then we get a lot of different relationships going. So the opposite of synonyms is antonyms, right? And two expressions are antonymous when they can't be true together. But considering what happens when they're false allows us to distinguish between two types of antonyms. So there's what we call contrary propositions and what we call contradictory. So they're contrary when they can't be true together, but when one of them is false, the other one can be true or false. Right? We don't care. They just can't be true together. Contradiction, on the other hand, occurs whenever one is true, the other has to be false. And whenever one is false, the other has to be true. So something like, I am here and I am not here. Those are contradictory because they can't both be true and they can't both be false. Whereas contrary propositions can be true, or cannot be true at the same time, but they can both be false. Contradiction, contrariness, those are antonyms. Now, compatibility is what happens when you can be true at the same time, but you don't have to. Right? So synonyms, if one is true, the other is true, because they mean the same thing. Compatibility just means they can be true at the same time. They could also be false. Right. Now, if they're false, then right, they can both be false together, they can both be true together. Again, that doesn't matter. Two expressions are compatible mutually. So if one is compatible, then we can flip those. Entailment is not a two-way proposition. It doesn't go both ways. And it's a more powerful kind of tool, and there's a special lecturette devoted to it. But essentially, entailment occurs when the following happens. If P is true, Q has to be true. It isn't just simply true, it has to be true. If P is false, then Q can do whatever it wants. So an example of entailment would be, there is a KU student in my office. That would entail that there is a student in my office. Because the truth conditions for a KU student being in my office, if they're met, they will guarantee that we satisfy the truth conditions of a student being in my office. Whereas, if there's not a student in my office, if there's not a KU student in my office, then there may be a student, maybe from another school, or not. We don't know. So these are extremely useful relationships, and they will allow us to build context in even more ingenious ways, right? Because now we don't have to create truth conditions that necessarily match the proposition. We can create, for instance, a context that entails the proposition that we want, or that is simply compatible with it. And so we, in the lecture, we'll practice some of these in more detail, and we'll get a better sense of how to use these relationships to a useful effect.